I was a park ranger in a remote stretch of forest in Oregon, an untouched expanse of wilderness where the trees seemed older than time itself. For years, I thought I knew every inch of those woods. I could read the trails like a map and predict the weather just by the smell of the air. But there was one part of the forest I always avoided, a deep, dense area the rangers called the silent zone. Radios didn't work there, compasses spun uselessly, and even the animals stayed away. It started with a disappearance. Emily Hargrove was a 24-year-old solo hiker, experienced and well-prepared. She'd checked in at the ranger station on a Thursday morning, smiling and chatting about her plans to explore one of the less-traveled trails. She never came back. When she didn't return by Friday evening, I organized a search team. We found her last known location deep in the silent zone. Her camp was the first thing we came across. The tent was shredded, its fabric fluttering weakly in the breeze, and her supplies were scattered across the ground. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no tracks, just silence. Her GPS and phone lay in the dirt, both completely drained of power. It wasn't just a dead battery. It was like something had sucked the life out of them. We pressed on, calling her name, the sound of our voices swallowed by the oppressive quiet. Then we found her pack leaning against a tree, zipped up neatly as if she'd set it there herself. That's when we heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like wood striking wood. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down my spine. The sound grew louder as we moved deeper into the forest, always just ahead of us, leading us on. By the time we reached the heart of the silent zone, it was getting dark. The trees were so tightly packed that the last rays of sunlight barely filtered through. The air felt heavy, like we were walking into a cave. Then we saw the clearing. It wasn't on any map. The trees opened into a perfect circle, the ground covered in moss and strange, twisting roots. In the center stood a massive tree, its trunk gnarled and blackened as if struck by lightning. Hanging from its branches were dozens of small wooden figures, crudely carved humanoid shapes tied together with bits of twine. They swayed gently, though there was no breeze. We found Emily there. She was standing at the base of the tree, her back to us, perfectly still. Her arms hung limply at her sides, and her head tilted upward as if she were staring at something in the branches. I called her name, but she didn't respond. One of the rangers moved toward her, his hand outstretched. The instant he touched her shoulder, she turned, and I'll never forget her face. Her eyes were wide and glassy, like she wasn't really seeing us. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Then she screamed, a high-pitched, keening wail that didn't sound human. She collapsed to the ground, convulsing, and the wooden figures hanging in the tree began to spin wildly, clicking and clattering like they were alive. We grabbed her and ran. The tapping sound started again, louder this time, coming from all around us. It wasn't just wood on wood anymore, it was something heavier, deliberate. It followed us all the way back to the edge of the silent zone, where the forest seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Emily didn't stop screaming until we reached the ranger station. She didn't remember anything. Not the tree, not the wooden figures, not even setting up camp. She just kept saying, "They were watching me. They were watching." She didn't explain who they were, and when we asked, her eyes filled with tears, and she begged us to stop. We filed our report, but nothing ever came of it. The authorities chalked it up to dehydration and hallucinations, despite the fact that Emily had been perfectly hydrated and in excellent health. She left the next day, refusing to stay another night. I don't blame her. The tapping didn't stop after that. I heard it sometimes on patrol, faint and distant, always in the direction of the silent zone. Other hikers reported strange sounds or feelings of being watched, and a few even described finding wooden figures tied to trees. None of them stayed in the forest for long. Then another hiker disappeared. This time it was a man in his late 30s, an experienced outdoorsman named Mark Devlin. He'd been hiking with a group, but had wandered off the trail to take photos. His friends said he was only gone for a few minutes, but when they went to look for him, he was nowhere to be found. We found his camera lying in the moss, the strap snapped clean. The last photo was a blurry shot of the massive blackened tree. We organized another search, but this time, no one volunteered to enter the silent zone. I had no choice but to go alone. The forest seemed angrier this time. The air was colder, the shadows darker, and the tapping was louder, more insistent. It guided me back to the clearing, though I tried to avoid it. When I arrived, the tree looked even more twisted than before, its branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The wooden figures were gone, replaced by larger ones, human-sized effigies bound with rope and covered in strange symbols. Mark was there, standing at the base of the tree, just like Emily had been. But he wasn't staring up at the branches. He was looking directly at me. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. Before I could respond, the tapping grew deafening, and the figures hanging from the tree began to writhe. The ground shook, the roots twisting and coiling like serpents. Mark stepped forward, his movements jerky and unnatural. "They don't like to be disturbed," he said, his voice layered, as if multiple people were speaking at once. I turned and ran, the sound of the tapping chasing me through the forest. I didn't stop until I reached the station, my lungs burning, my mind reeling. I never went back. The silent zone was closed off after that, officially due to unsafe conditions. But I know the truth. Something lives in that forest, something ancient and angry. It doesn't want us there. And if you go deep enough, if you hear the tapping, it might decide to let you leave. But you won't come back the same. And some don't come back at all. The silent zone haunted me long after I left the ranger station. Even when I resigned, packed my bags, and tried to move on with my life, it followed me. The whispers in the trees, the tapping in the night, it stayed with me like a scar. But scars don't bleed. They don't get worse with time. This one did. The nightmares were the worst part. They didn't feel like dreams. They felt like memories. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the sound of that tapping echoing in my ears. In the dreams, I was always back in the clearing. The tree loomed over me, its blackened trunk writhing with the shadows of something I could never quite see. And the effigies, those wooden figures, they moved. They twisted and swayed like they were alive, their empty eyes boring into me. I started hearing the tapping outside my apartment late at night. Faint at first, like someone gently knocking on the window, even though I lived on the 3rd floor. Then it grew louder, more insistent, coming from the walls, the floors, even the ceiling. It followed me everywhere, at work, at the grocery store, even in broad daylight. I couldn't escape it. One night, after weeks of sleepless nights, I heard a voice. It wasn't in my head. It came from the shadows in the corner of my room, low and guttural, like it had been dragged through the dirt. "Come back," it said. "You left something behind." I thought I was losing my mind. Maybe I was. But I knew deep down that it wasn't over. It wouldn't let me go. Whatever was in the silent zone wasn't done with me. I didn't go back willingly. It pulled me, like a magnet, dragging me toward the forest no matter how much I tried to resist. I quit my job, emptied my savings, and drove halfway across the country back to that ranger station. I told myself it was for closure, but the truth was, I didn't have a choice. It had taken root inside me, and I couldn't tear it out. The station was abandoned. It had been closed down not long after I left, though no one would tell me why. The windows were boarded up, the trails overgrown. The silent zone had been fenced off with heavy chains and warning signs. "Do not enter. Extreme danger." I ignored them. The tapping had grown louder with every step closer to the forest, like a drumbeat in my skull. By the time I reached the fence, it was deafening. My hands shook as I climbed over, the chains rattling like bones. The moment my feet hit the ground, the forest went silent. Not just quiet, silent. No birds, no wind, no rustle of leaves. Just the oppressive weight of a silence so thick it felt alive. The trail was gone, swallowed by the forest. The trees pressed in around me, their gnarled branches reaching out like claws. I tried to find my way back to the clearing, but the forest twisted and shifted, leading me in circles. The tapping was everywhere now, coming from every direction, growing louder and faster until it felt like my head would split open. Then I saw it. The clearing wasn't how I remembered it. The blackened tree was still there, but it had grown. Its twisted branches stretched higher, darker, more menacing, and the effigies, they weren't wooden anymore. They were flesh and bone, hanging by their necks, their bodies swaying in a non-existent breeze. Their eyes were open, staring at me with hollow, lifeless gazes. In the center of the clearing stood Mark. But it wasn't Mark. Not anymore. His body was gaunt, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "You came back," he said, his voice layered with something deep and guttural, something not human. "You're not Mark," I said, my voice trembling. "No," he replied, stepping closer. "Mark is gone. But he left the door open and now we're here." I took a step back, my legs shaking. "What do you want from me?" "You saw us," he said, his head tilting unnaturally to one side. "You survived. That makes you useful." The ground began to shake, the tree groaning as its branches twisted and writhed. The effigies swung wildly, their hollow eyes locked on me. The tapping grew louder, more frenzied, as shadows spilled out of the tree like ink, pooling at its base before rising into shapes. Humanoid, but wrong. Too tall, too thin, their limbs bending at impossible angles. "You brought others here," Mark said, his smile widening. "They didn't belong, but you belong." I ran. The shadows surged toward me, their movements jerky and unnatural, their arms outstretched. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees blocking my path, their branches clawing at my face and arms. The tapping followed me, growing louder and faster until it felt like my chest would explode. I don't know how I made it out. One moment, I was running through the suffocating darkness, and the next, I was stumbling into the pale light of dawn. The tapping stopped. The forest was still, almost peaceful, but I could feel it watching me, waiting. I drove straight home, but it didn't feel like a victory. The tapping still follows me, softer now, like a whisper just out of earshot. I see shadows in the corners of my vision, shapes that disappear when I turn to look. And the nightmares, they're worse than ever. I don't know what I left behind in that forest, or what I brought back with me. But I know one thing for sure. It's not over. Whatever lives in the silent zone isn't just there. It's here too. And it's waiting for the door to open again. The nightmares didn't stop after I left the silent zone for the second time. If anything, they grew worse, more vivid, more real. The tapping followed me into my dreams, growing louder and louder until I woke up gasping for air. But the dreams weren't just dreams. They felt like glimpses into something bigger, something ancient. In one dream, I stood in the clearing, but it wasn't the same clearing I remembered. The blackened tree had grown even larger, its branches stretching into the sky like veins in a withered hand. Around it, figures moved, faceless shadows that carried the same sickly weight as Mark's voice had. They whispered in a language I couldn't understand, but I felt their meaning deep in my chest. "You opened the door," they said. "Now it cannot be closed." Every night, the dreams grew more detailed. I saw the tree cracking open, its trunk splitting to reveal a gaping maw filled with writhing tendrils. I saw the effigies, human-shaped horrors of bone and sinew, marching into the world beyond the forest, and I saw myself standing among them, my face hollow, my eyes glowing faintly like marks. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, trauma manifesting in the only way it could. But the tapping grew louder during the day. It came from the walls of my apartment, the floorboards beneath my feet, the very air around me. No one else could hear it, no matter how hard I tried to make them listen. I saw them next. The shadows. At first, it was only in the corners of my vision, something dark and tall, flickering just beyond my sight. But then they started stepping closer. They moved unnaturally, jerking forward like puppets pulled by strings. I'd see them standing at the end of my hallway, their eyeless faces fixed on me. But when I looked again, they were gone. I couldn't take it anymore. I thought I was losing my mind, that the forest had broken something inside me. I moved out of my apartment, threw my phone into a river, and drove halfway across the country to a remote cabin I'd rented under a fake name. I thought maybe if I isolated myself, if I cut off everything that tied me to the forest, it would stop. It didn't. The first night in the cabin, the tapping started again. It was faint at first, like raindrops on the roof. But by midnight, it was deafening. The walls shook with it, the windows rattling in their frames. I stepped outside thinking maybe it was the wind or an animal, but the forest around the cabin was completely still. Then I saw them. The shadows weren't hiding anymore. They stood at the edge of the clearing, dozens of them, their shapes twisted and wrong. Their eyeless faces were turned toward me, and though they made no sound, I could feel their whispers in my mind. "You belong to us," they said. I backed into the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. But the tapping didn't stop. It grew louder, shaking the walls, the floor, the air itself. I screamed for it to stop, but the shadows didn't move. They just stood there, waiting. By morning, they were gone. The forest was quiet, the tapping silenced. But I knew it wasn't over. The next few weeks were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. The shadows came every night, always standing just beyond the clearing, watching. The tapping followed me everywhere, growing louder the closer I got to sleep. My reflection started to change too. At first it was subtle. My eyes seemed a little darker, my face a little paler, but then it became undeniable. My reflection smiled when I didn't. It moved when I stood still. One night, I woke up to find my reflection standing at the foot of my bed. "You can't run from it," it said, its voice a hollow echo of my own. "You opened the door. You have to go back." I didn't sleep after that. It wasn't until a month later that I finally gave in. The tapping, the shadows, the whispers, they were breaking me. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think. And deep down, I knew the truth. The forest had marked me. I could run to the ends of the earth, but it would follow me. The only way to end it was to go back. I returned to Oregon, driving through the night until I reached the abandoned ranger station. The silent zone was as I'd left it, overgrown, fenced off, forgotten. But the moment I crossed the threshold, the forest seemed to come alive. The air was heavier, the trees darker, their branches reaching out like claws. The tapping started immediately, louder than ever. It wasn't coming from the trees anymore. It was coming from inside me. The forest didn't twist this time. It led me straight to the clearing, as if it had been waiting for me. The blackened tree stood taller than ever, its branches stretching into the stormy sky. The effigies were gone, replaced by something worse. Figures stood around the tree, their faces hollow, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I recognized some of them, Mark, Emily, even Rourke. But the others were strangers, their faces twisted in pain. "You came back," Mark said, stepping forward. His voice was layered, filled with something ancient and wrong. "It's time." "For what?" I asked, my voice shaking. "To finish what you started." The tree groaned, its trunk splitting open to reveal a gaping void filled with writhing shadows. The figures around it began to chant, their voices blending into a low, guttural hum that made my teeth ache. The shadows spilled out of the tree, surging toward me like a wave. I didn't run this time. I couldn't. The shadows engulfed me, their cold fingers clawing at my skin, pulling me into the tree's hollow. I felt myself falling, the world spinning into darkness. When I woke, I was in the clearing, but it wasn't the same. The forest was alive, its trees pulsing like veins, their branches dripping with shadows. The figures stood around me, their eyes glowing brighter than ever. "You belong to us," they said in unison. "I don't know how long I've been here. Days? Weeks? Time doesn't work the same anymore. The forest has swallowed me whole, and I've become part of it. The tapping never stops now. It's in my head, in my chest, in every breath I take. And I know I'll never leave. Because the silent zone isn't just a place, it's alive. And now, so am I."